The scissors gleamed silver in Margaret Chen's trembling hands as she stood in her son's bedroom, staring at the ivory silk that hung like a ghost in the closet. The wedding dress, her daughter-in-law's wedding dress, seemed to mock her with its perfect beadwork and delicate lace sleeves. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding. 3 weeks since she had bitten her tongue and smiled through gritted teeth as everyone praised how radiant Emma looked, how perfect the ceremony had been, how lucky her son David was to have found such a wonderful girl. But Margaret knew better. She had always known better. The afternoon sun streamed through the bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor where cardboard boxes sat half-packed. Emma and David were supposed to return from their honeymoon tomorrow, ready to move into their new apartment across town. Margaret had volunteered to help pack Emma's belongings from the guest room where she'd been staying for the past 6 months, a gesture David had called incredibly thoughtful, and Emma had accepted with that same polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. Margaret's fingers traced the delicate beadwork along the dress's bodice. Hand-sewn, the boutique owner had boasted. 3 months of alterations to achieve that perfect fit. $2,000 that could have gone towards something practical, something that would last longer than a single day. But Emma had insisted, and David had indulged her, as he always did. "She's not right for him," Margaret whispered to the empty room, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the air conditioning. It was the same thing she'd been saying for 2 years, ever since David had first brought Emma home for dinner. Too quiet, too reserved, too different from their family. While the Chen family gathered around the dinner table sharing stories and laughter, Emma would sit there with that same polite smile, contributing only when directly asked a question. Margaret's sister Linda had tried to reassure her. "Maybe she's just shy, Maggie. Some people take longer to warm up." But Margaret had raised 3 children, had welcomed 2 other daughters-in-law into their family with open arms. She knew the difference between shyness and deliberate distance. The wedding had been beautiful, she couldn't deny that. St. Mary's Cathedral had been decorated with white roses and baby's breath, the same flowers Margaret had chosen for her own wedding 35 years ago. Emma had looked stunning walking down that aisle in this very dress, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo, her makeup flawless, despite the tears that had threatened to spill during the ceremony. But it was the moments between the public displays that haunted Margaret. The way Emma had pulled away when Margaret tried to fix her veil before the ceremony. The stilted conversation during the mother-son dance when Margaret had attempted to express how happy she was for them. The polite but distant thank you when Margaret had gifted her the family pearl necklace that had been passed down for 3 generations of Chen women. Margaret set the scissors down on David's old desk, the same desk where he'd done his homework throughout high school, where he'd stayed up late writing college application essays. His son was brilliant, a software engineer with his own startup, kind-hearted and generous to a fault. He deserved someone who would love not just him, but his family too. Someone who would carry on their traditions, who would raise their children to understand the importance of family bonds that Margaret and her late husband had worked so hard to build. The dress rustled as a breeze from the air conditioning vent stirred it gently. Margaret had tried, truly tried to connect with Emma. She'd invited her to their weekly family dinners, had offered to teach her how to make David's favorite dumplings, had even suggested they go shopping together for wedding decorations. But Emma had declined each invitation with the same polite excuses. Work was busy, she had other commitments, she was feeling under the weather. "Maybe if she saw how much pain she causes," Margaret murmured, picking up the scissors again. The metal felt cold and substantial in her grip. Maybe if she understood what it means to lose something precious. She had discovered the dress hanging in the closet that morning while packing Emma's winter coats. It should have been preserved, boxed up in acid-free tissue paper and stored properly. Instead, it hung there carelessly, still bearing a small stain on the hem from the outdoor reception, a testament to Emma's lack of appreciation for beautiful things. Margaret's hands shook as she positioned the scissors at the dress's neckline. She thought of her own wedding dress, carefully preserved in a cedar chest in her bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper that she replaced every few years. She thought of the dress her mother had worn, destroyed in the fire that had taken their family home when Margaret was 17. Some things were meant to be treasured, protected, passed down through generations. But this dress represented everything that was wrong with Emma's place in their family. It was beautiful on the surface, but lacked the deeper meaning that came from genuine connection, from real love that extended beyond the couple to embrace the entire family network that marriage was meant to strengthen. The first cut through the silk made a soft whisper, like a secret being told. Margaret paused, her heart hammering in her chest. Once she started this path, there would be no going back. David would be furious. Emma would be devastated. But perhaps devastation would crack that polite facade, would force Emma to show some real emotion for once, would make her realize what she was throwing away by keeping herself so separate from the people who loved David most. Margaret continued cutting, working methodically through the bodice, the skirt, the delicate sleeves. Each snip felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of power in a situation where she'd felt increasingly helpless. The beadwork scattered across the floor like fallen stars, the lace dissolving into fragments of what it had once been. It was only when she reached the dress's deep side pocket, a practical addition that the seamstress had suggested for holding tissues and lipstick during the long wedding day, that Margaret's scissors encountered something that made her pause. Her fingers probed the pocket, expecting perhaps a tissue or a piece of jewelry. Instead, she pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges. Margaret's breath caught as she unfolded the paper, recognizing immediately the shaky handwriting of her late husband, Robert. The paper was a note written in his characteristic, careful script, the words she remembered him writing during the final weeks of his battle with cancer 2 years ago. "My dearest Margaret, I know how hard it will be for you when I'm gone. You've always been the heart of our family, the one who brings everyone together. But remember that love isn't about control, it's about trust. When David finds the right person, you'll know because you'll see how happy she makes him, not how well she fits into the box you've built for her. Trust his heart, my love. Trust that we raised him to choose well. And remember that sometimes the quietest love runs the deepest. All my love, Robert." Margaret's hands began to tremble violently as the full implication of the note hit her. Robert had written this during his final hospital stay when Emma was there every day, sitting quietly in the corner of the room while David held his father's hand. Emma, who had brought homemade soup when Margaret was too exhausted to cook. Emma, who had taken over the night shifts so Margaret could get some rest. Emma, who had handled the funeral arrangements with quiet efficiency when Margaret had been too overwhelmed with grief to think clearly. But how had this note gotten into Emma's wedding dress pocket? Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities, landing on the memory she'd pushed away. The morning of the wedding, when she'd found Emma in the bridal suite, crying silently as she stared at a photo of Robert. Margaret had been too focused on last-minute preparations to stop and ask why Emma was upset, too caught up in her own anxiety about the wedding to notice that Emma's tears weren't about wedding nerves. The destroyed dress lay around Margaret's feet like the ruins of her assumptions. She sank into David's desk chair, the note still clutched in her shaking hands, as the afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the destruction she had wrought in her certainty that she knew best. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Margaret's heart stopped as she heard familiar voices in the driveway, luggage wheels rolling across concrete, David's laugh mixing with Emma's quieter response. They were home early. They were home, and she was sitting in the ruins of a wedding dress with a note that changed everything she thought she knew about her daughter-in-law. "Mom?" David's voice called from downstairs. "Are you here? Your car's in the driveway." Margaret stared at the note in her hands, at the scattered beads and torn fabric around her feet, at the scissors that lay like an accusation on the desk beside her. In that moment, she realized she had destroyed far more than a dress. She had destroyed her own understanding of love, of family, and of the quiet, steady devotion that had been right in front of her all along. The footsteps on the stairs grew closer, and Margaret knew that in just moments she would have to face the consequences of her actions and the devastating truth of what she had discovered hidden in that pocket. Margaret Chen had always prided herself on being a woman who knew her own mind. At 62, she had raised 3 successful children, had navigated 35 years of marriage to a man she'd adored, and had built a life centered around family traditions that stretched back to her grandmother's generation in Taiwan. Her morning routine reflected this certainty. Up at 6:30, green tea while reading the newspaper, then a walk through the neighborhood where she'd lived for 25 years, greeting the same neighbors, following the same path past the elementary school where her children had learned to read. But sitting in her son's bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of Emma's wedding dress, Margaret felt the foundation of that certainty crumbling beneath her feet like sand at high tide. She had always been the family's emotional center, the one who remembered birthdays and organized gatherings, who made sure everyone felt included and loved. When Robert had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, she had thrown herself into caring for him with the same fierce determination that had carried her through every challenge in their marriage. She had researched treatments, organized schedules, maintained hope when the doctors offered only statistics. The note in her hands felt heavier than paper should. She read Robert's words again, trying to reconcile them with her memories of those final weeks. She remembered Emma's quiet presence in the hospital room, but she had interpreted it as obligation rather than genuine care. Emma would sit in the corner chair, usually with a book or her laptop, rarely speaking unless spoken to. She had seen it as evidence of Emma's fundamental disconnect from our family. Why couldn't she engage more, talk more, show her emotions more openly? Now, forced to reconsider those memories through the lens of Robert's note, Margaret began to see a different picture. Emma's silence hadn't been indifference. It had been respect for our grief, a recognition that this was their time as a family to say goodbye. Her quiet presence had been a form of support, allowing David to focus on his father without worrying about whether his fiancée was being entertained or included. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from her daughter Sarah, still living in Seattle with her own family. "How's the packing going, Mom? I'm sure Emma appreciates the help." The irony of the message made Margaret's stomach clench. She set the phone aside without responding, unable to face the complicated task of explaining what she had done. The footsteps on the stairs had stopped, and she could hear David and Emma's voices drifting up from the kitchen. They were discussing their flight, something about turbulence over Denver, their voices carrying the easy intimacy of a couple comfortable in each other's presence. Margaret had always noticed how different David seemed with Emma, calmer somehow, more thoughtful. She had attributed it to Emma's influence, making him too serious, too reserved. But listening now, she heard something else: contentment. Margaret stood slowly, her knees protesting after sitting hunched over the destroyed dress. At 62, her body was beginning to remind her daily of its limitations. The arthritis in her hands that made opening jars difficult, the reading glasses she now needed for even the simplest tasks, the way she tired more easily during her morning walks. Robert's death had accelerated these changes, as if grief itself was aging her from the inside out. She moved to the bedroom window, looking down at the rental car in the driveway, its trunk still open with suitcases visible inside. Emma had insisted they rent a car for their honeymoon road trip instead of flying somewhere tropical. David loves driving through new places, she had told Margaret during one of their rare conversations. He's always pointing out architecture and historical markers. I thought he might enjoy the scenic route through the mountains. At the time, Margaret had seen this as evidence that Emma didn't understand luxury, didn't appreciate the finer things that David could now afford. But reconsidering it now, she realized Emma had chosen their honeymoon based entirely on what would make David happy, not on what would photograph well for social media or impress their friends. Margaret had grown up as the youngest of 4 daughters in a household where love was demonstrated through grand gestures and constant chatter. Her mother had been a vibrant woman who filled every room she entered with laughter and stories. Margaret had learned early that attention and affection went to those who could command them, who could hold the spotlight and keep a conversation flowing. It was a lesson that had served her well in her own marriage. Robert had been drawn to her vivacity, her ability to make any gathering feel more alive. But Emma operated from a completely different playbook. She showed love through small, quiet actions, remembering that David preferred his coffee black in the morning, but with cream in the afternoon, keeping track of his work deadlines so she could remind him to eat lunch during stressful periods, listening without judgment when he needed to talk through a problem. Margaret had dismissed these gestures as basic relationship maintenance, but now she wondered if she had misunderstood the profound intimacy they represented. The bedroom door creaked as a draft from the air conditioning moved through the house. Margaret looked at the dress fragments scattered across the floor and felt a wave of panic wash over her. How could she possibly explain this? How could she tell David and Emma that she had destroyed something precious because she had been too proud, too certain of her own judgment to see what was right in front of her? She knelt down and began gathering the largest pieces of fabric, her hands shaking as she tried to assess whether any of it could be salvaged. The beadwork was scattered like a constellation across the hardwood floor, each tiny pearl and crystal catching the afternoon light. The lace sleeves were beyond repair, cut into strips that could never be pieced back together. The bodice, which had taken the seamstress weeks to construct, was now just fragments of silk and tulle. Margaret's phone buzzed again, this time with a text from her eldest son, Michael, in Chicago. "Hope the newlyweds had a great honeymoon. Tell Emma thanks again for the wedding favors. Jennifer has been using that lavender soap every night. She said Emma must have remembered her mentioning she had trouble sleeping." Margaret stared at the message, another piece of evidence that she had fundamentally misunderstood Emma's character. She remembered Emma asking seemingly casual questions about family members' preferences and interests, but Margaret had interpreted it as polite small talk rather than genuine care. The voices downstairs grew closer, and Margaret heard David calling her name again. She stood up, clutching the largest piece of the dress's skirt, and tried to formulate some explanation that wouldn't reveal the depth of her misjudgment. But every possible excuse fell apart under the weight of Robert's note, which she had folded carefully and placed in her pocket next to her phone. Margaret had always believed that a mother's instincts about their children's partners were rarely wrong. She had liked David's college girlfriend instantly, a bubbly communications major who had fit seamlessly into our family dynamic. She had been devastated when that relationship ended, convinced that David was making a mistake. When he'd started dating Emma 2 years later, Margaret was determined to not let another good woman slip away. But Emma wasn't like the previous girlfriend. Emma didn't laugh at Robert's dad jokes or compliment Margaret's cooking with enthusiastic superlatives. Emma listened more than she spoke, observed more than she participated. Looking back now, Margaret realized she had been trying to force Emma into a mold that didn't fit her personality. She expected Emma to demonstrate love the same way Margaret did, through vocal appreciation, through visible enthusiasm, through constant engagement. But Emma's love language was quieter, more subtle. She showed up consistently, remembered details, took care of practical needs without being asked. The bedroom felt smaller now, cluttered with boxes and the evidence of Margaret's destructive certainty. She had spent 2 years building a case against Emma, collecting small grievances like evidence in a trial. Emma's reluctance to share personal stories during family dinners, her polite but distant responses to Margaret's attempts at advice, her habit of checking her phone during gatherings, which Margaret had interpreted as rudeness rather than work obligations. But underneath those surface judgments had been a deeper fear that Margaret was only now beginning to acknowledge. Emma represented a fundamental shift in her family's dynamic, where Margaret had always been the central organizer, the emotional hub around which everyone else orbited. Emma's quiet competence suggested a different model of family life. Emma didn't need Margaret's guidance or approval in the way that Margaret had expected. She had her own relationship with David that existed independently of Margaret's influence, and that independence felt like a threat to the role Margaret had built her identity around. Margaret's reflection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, definitely getting closer now. She looked around the room desperately, but there was no way to hide what she had done. The destroyed dress was too scattered, too obviously demolished to explain away as an accident. She would have to face them, would have to explain her actions and live with the consequences. But first, she pulled Robert's note from her pocket and read it one more time. Sometimes the quietest love runs the deepest. The words hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the possibility that she had spent 2 years misunderstanding not just Emma, but the very nature of love itself. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door, and Margaret heard David's voice, closer now and tinged with confusion. "Emma, did you leave your dress hanging in here? I thought we were going to take it to be preserved." His voice trailed off, and Margaret knew he could see through the partially open door. She heard Emma's sharp intake of breath, the kind of sound that comes from witnessing something incomprehensible. The door swung open fully, and David stepped into the room first, his travel clothes wrinkled from their long drive home. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning horror as he took in the scene before him. Emma appeared behind him, still carrying her purse, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a messy bun from their journey. When she saw the destroyed dress, her face went completely pale, and she gripped the doorframe as if she might fall. "Mom." David's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute devastation. "What did you do?" Margaret stood frozen in the center of the destruction, still clutching a piece of torn silk. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. How could she explain that she had been trying to teach Emma a lesson about appreciation? How could she justify destroying something beautiful because she had felt threatened by Emma's quiet strength? Emma stepped forward slowly, as if walking through a crime scene. She knelt down and picked up one of the beaded sleeves, holding it with the same gentle care she might show to an injured bird. When she looked up at Margaret, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "This was my grandmother's pattern. She made her wedding dress in 1952 with this exact beadwork design. When she died last year, I had the seamstress recreate it as closely as possible. It was the only way I could have her with me on my wedding day." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had known that Emma's grandmother had died shortly before the wedding, but Emma had never spoken about the dress's significance. Margaret had assumed it was just another expensive garment purchased to make an impression rather than to honor family tradition. David ran his hair through his hair, a gesture Margaret recognized from his childhood when he was trying to process something overwhelming. "Mom, I don't understand. Why would you? How could you?" He looked around the room as if searching for some explanation that would make this make sense. "I found this," Margaret said finally, pulling Robert's note from her pocket with shaking hands. "I don't understand how it got there or why Emma would have it or—" Emma looked up from where she was kneeling among the fabric pieces. "He gave it to me," she said simply, "the day before he died. He said I wanted it to have in case I ever doubted that I belonged in your family." "He was worried about you," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "He could see how hard you were trying to accept me, and he was afraid that after he was gone, you might give up trying altogether." She stood up slowly, still holding the damaged sleeve. "He told me that you had always been the heart of the family, but that grief sometimes makes people's hearts close up. He wanted me to remember that your resistance came from love, not from hatred." David's face had gone from shock to something approaching fury. "Dad wrote you a note about my mother and you never told me?" Emma looked between them, her composure finally beginning to crack. "He made me promise not to show it to anyone unless it became absolutely necessary.
He said Margaret needed to find her own way to accepting me, and that if I used his words as ammunition, it would only make things worse. Margaret's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. She ignored it, but the sound seemed to break something open in David. "Do you know what Emma did while we were planning the wedding?" David asked, his voice rising. "She spent 3 weeks researching traditional Chinese wedding customs because she wanted to incorporate something meaningful for our family. She learned how to make your mother's dumpling recipe from YouTube videos because she wanted to surprise you. She bought that stupid, expensive tea set you admired at the department store because she thought it might give you two something to bond over." Emma placed a hand on David's arm. "David, don't!" "No, Emma, she needs to hear this." David shook off his wife's restraining touch. "She needs to know that while you were judging her for being too quiet, too distant, too different, you were trying everything you could think of to win her over." Margaret's phone buzzed again, and this time David pulled out his own device. His face went even paler as he read whatever message he'd received. "It's Sarah," he said, looking up at Margaret with something approaching disgust. "She's asking if everything is okay because you haven't responded to her texts, and she's worried something happened during the packing." He looked around the destroyed room. "Something did happen, didn't it, Mom?" Emma was moving around the room now, carefully gathering pieces of the dress like she was collecting the fragments of something sacred. Margaret watched her work, noting the methodical way she sorted the beadwork from the fabric, the gentle care she showed to each ruined piece. Even now, even facing the destruction of something irreplaceable, Emma's movements were controlled and purposeful. "Emma," Margaret said finally, her voice hoarse, "I am so sorry. I believed that you didn't care about us, about this family. I thought you were keeping yourself separate on purpose." Emma looked up from her careful gathering. "I was terrified," she said simply. "I've never been good with big families, with the kind of warmth and openness your family has. My parents died when I was 19, and I lived with my grandmother until she passed last year. It was just the two of us for so long. I didn't know how to be part of something bigger."
She held up a handful of scattered beads, letting them catch the afternoon light. "Your family is so alive, so full of stories and laughter and traditions. I was afraid that if I tried too hard to fit in, you'd see right through me and realize I didn't belong. So I tried to be helpful instead of trying to be entertaining. I tried to show love through actions instead of words, because words have always been harder for me." David sat down heavily on his old bed, his head in his hands. "God, Emma, why didn't you tell me how hard this was for you?" "Because you love your family so much," Emma said, kneeling beside a pile of torn lace. "You light up when you talk about your childhood, about all the memories you made together. I didn't want to be the person who made that complicated for you. I thought if I could just be patient, if I could just prove myself through consistency, maybe eventually I'd find my place." Margaret's phone buzzed a third time, and she finally pulled it out to silence it. But the message on the screen made her breath catch. It was from Linda, her sister. "Maggie, I just talked to Mrs. Patterson from down the street. She said she saw Emma's car at the house and wanted to know if she could drop off that quilt she made for the newlyweds. Should I tell her to wait until tomorrow?" The mention of Mrs. Patterson triggered another memory that Margaret had pushed aside. 3 months ago, she had mentioned to Emma that their elderly neighbor was struggling with her garden after a fall. The next week, Margaret had looked out her kitchen window to see Emma kneeling in Mrs. Patterson's flower beds, carefully weeding and replanting. When Margaret had asked Mrs. Patterson about it later, the older woman had gushed about how sweet and helpful Emma was, how she came by every Saturday morning to help with the heavy garden work. "You've been helping Mrs. Patterson with her garden?" Margaret said suddenly, the realization hitting her like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Emma nodded without looking up from her careful sorting. "She reminded me of my grandmother, and David mentioned once that she had been friends with your family for decades. I thought maybe if I could help her, it would be a way of contributing to the community that raised him. She never told me you were doing that, Margaret said weakly. I asked her not to. I didn't want you to think I was trying to score points or manipulate you into liking me. I just wanted to help. David looked up from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed. Emma, you don't understand what this family is like. We talk about everything. We share every little thing that happens to us. The fact that you were doing all these thoughtful things, but asking people not to tell us about them, it made Mom think you were hiding something, being secretive on purpose. Emma finally stopped her careful gathering and sat back on her heels. I was raised by a woman who believed that good deeds should be done quietly, without expecting recognition. My grandmother always said that if you do something kind and then talk about it, you're not being kind for the right reasons. She looked directly at Margaret for the first time since entering the room. I realize now that what felt like humility to me probably looked like distance to you. Margaret sank into David's desk chair, overwhelmed by the mounting evidence of her misunderstanding. Every gesture she had interpreted as coldness or rejection had been Emma's attempt to show respect and love in the only way she knew it. Emma hadn't been keeping herself separate from the family. She had been trying to serve it from the margins, believing that her quiet contributions would eventually earn her a place at the table. The afternoon sun had shifted, and the room was growing dimmer. David stood up and turned on the overhead light, illuminating the full extent of the destruction with harsh clarity. Pieces of Emma's wedding dress were scattered across almost every surface of the room, beads glittering on the hardwood floor, lace fragments caught on the furniture, silk pieces that had once been carefully constructed into something beautiful, now reduced to expensive waste. I can try to have it repaired, Margaret said desperately, knowing even as she spoke that it was impossible. There have to be seamstresses who specialize in restoration. Mom, stop. David's voice was flat, exhausted. Look at it. Really, look at it. You didn't just damage the dress, you destroyed it completely. Those beads took weeks to sew on by hand. The lace was hand-tatted by the seamstress, using a pattern that took Emma months to track down. You can't just repair something like this.
Emma stood up slowly, still holding a handful of the torn fabric. It's okay, she said quietly. It's just a dress. No, it's not just a dress. David's voice exploded through the room. It was your grandmother's pattern. It was your way of having her with you on our wedding day. It was the dress you chose for the most important day of our lives, and my mother destroyed it because she couldn't see past her own prejudices. Emma flinched at the volume of David's voice, and Margaret saw clearly for the first time how overwhelming her family's emotional intensity must be for someone who had grown up in quiet, careful conversation with an elderly grandmother. Emma wasn't cold or distant. She was calibrated for a completely different frequency of emotional expression. "David, please," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but yelling isn't going to fix anything. Then what is going to fix this? David demanded, gesturing at the destroyed dress, at Margaret's tear-stained face, at the gulf of misunderstanding that had finally been exposed. How do we fix 2 years of Mom treating you like an outsider? How do we fix the fact that she destroyed something irreplaceable because she was so convinced she knew better than everyone else? Margaret watched Emma's face during David's outburst and saw something she had never noticed before. Emma wasn't unmoved by the emotional storm around her. She was absorbing it, processing it, trying to find a way to respond that would help rather than escalate. Her quietness wasn't indifference. It was emotional intelligence of a kind Margaret had never encountered. We don't fix it, Emma said finally. We learn from it. We figure out how to do better going forward. She looked directly at Margaret, her eyes still bright with unshed tears, but her voice steady. Margaret,
I need you to know that I never wanted to replace you in David's life. I never wanted to change your family or take anything away from what you've built together. I just wanted to add to it, to contribute something good to this beautiful thing you and Robert created. The use of Robert's name in that context, linking Margaret's efforts as a mother to Robert's memory, acknowledging the partnership that had built their family, broke something open in Margaret's chest. She began to cry in earnest for the first time since entering the room, not the careful tears of regret she'd been holding back, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose entire understanding of herself had been shattered. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting our family. I thought you were going to take him away from us, make him into someone different. Emma knelt down in front of Margaret's chair, her hands full of torn silk and scattered beads. David is exactly who he should be, she said softly. He's kind and funny and brilliant, and he loves his family more than anything in the world. I fell in love with him partly because of how much he loves you, how much he values the childhood you and Robert gave him. Why would I want to change that? Margaret looked into Emma's face, really looked at her for what felt like the first time, and saw the woman her son had fallen in love with. Not the distant stranger Margaret had constructed in her mind, but a thoughtful, gentle person who had been trying to honor Margaret's family in the only way she knew how. But the moment of understanding came too late. The dress lay destroyed around them, Robert's note had been revealed in the worst possible way, and David was looking at Margaret with a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger could have. Some mistakes couldn't be undone with apologies, no matter how heartfelt. In the silence that followed Emma's gentle words, Margaret became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed before. The distant hum of traffic from the main road, the rhythmic ticking of David's old alarm clock on the nightstand, the whisper of fabric settling as the torn pieces of the dress finally came to rest. The room felt suspended in time, as if the three of them were trapped in a moment that would define everything that came after.
David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with irritation before his expression changed. "It's Michael," he said, his voice still tight with anger. "He says Sarah's been trying to reach Mom all afternoon, and they're both worried." He looked at Margaret with something approaching disgust. "I guess you'll have to explain to the whole family what you've done." Margaret felt her stomach clench at the thought of telling her other children about this moment. Michael, her practical eldest son who had always been the family peacemaker. Sarah, her daughter, who had immediately embraced Emma as the sister she'd always wanted. How could she explain that she had destroyed something precious because she had been too proud to see what was right in front of her? Emma was still kneeling among the dress fragments, her movements methodical as she continued to sort through the pieces. Margaret watched her work and realized that even in this moment of devastation, Emma was trying to salvage what she could. It was so characteristic of her approach to everything. Find what can be saved, work with what remains, don't waste energy mourning what's beyond repair. "I need to call them back," David said, his thumb hovering over his phone. "What am I supposed to tell them, Mom? That you had some kind of breakdown and destroyed Emma's wedding dress?" "David," Emma said quietly, not looking up from her sorting, "maybe we should take some time to process this before involving the rest of the family." "Why?" David's voice cracked with exhaustion. "So Mom can come up with some story that makes her look less—" He gestured helplessly at the destruction around them. "Because," Emma said, finally looking up at him, "your siblings love your mother, and they love you. And when they hear about this, they're going to be hurt and confused and angry just like you are. But unlike you, they weren't here to see how this happened. They won't understand the context." Margaret felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. Even now, even after everything she had done, Emma was trying to protect her from the family's judgment. It was the kind of thoughtfulness that Margaret had completely failed to recognize, interpreting it instead as manipulation or false politeness. David's phone rang in his hand, Sarah's name appearing on the screen. He stared at it for a moment before declining the call. She's just going to keep calling until someone answers. Then answer, Emma said simply. Tell her we got home safely and that we're unpacking. Tell her we'll call her tomorrow when we're less tired. You want me to lie to my sister? David asked. Emma's hands stilled in their sorting. I want you to give your mother a chance to figure out how to make this right before you burn down every relationship in your family. The generosity of that statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. Emma was still trying to preserve Margaret's relationships with her other children, still trying to minimize the damage Margaret had caused. It was the kind of quiet protection that Margaret had completely dismissed as weakness, when in reality it required enormous strength. Margaret's phone began ringing, Michael's name flashing on the screen. She looked at it helplessly, then at David, then at Emma, who was now holding what had once been the dress's intricate beaded bodice. I'll talk to him, Margaret said, her voice barely audible. She answered the call with shaking hands. Mom? Thank God. Sarah's been trying to reach you for hours. She was about to drive over there. I'm fine, sweetheart, Margaret said, the lie catching in her throat. David and Emma just got home and we've been talking.
How was the honeymoon? Sarah said Emma left her some kind of care package for the guest room. Homemade soap and tea or something. That was thoughtful. Margaret closed her eyes. Another small kindness she had missed entirely. Yes, very thoughtful. Is everything okay, Mom? You sound strange. Margaret looked across the room at Emma, who was now carefully folding the larger pieces of fabric, her movements precise despite the tears that were finally falling silently down her cheeks. David sat on the edge of his bed, watching his wife with an expression of such tender concern that Margaret felt her heart breaking for what she had put him through. Michael, I need to tell you something. Margaret began, then stopped. How could she explain this over the phone? How could she make him understand the complexity of what had happened without destroying his faith in her judgment forever? Mom, you're scaring me. What's wrong? David looked up at her, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been hope. He was waiting to see if she would tell the truth or try to minimize what she had done. Emma continued her careful work, giving no indication that she was listening, but Margaret knew that this moment would determine everything that came after. I made a terrible mistake, Margaret said finally. I did something that hurt Emma, something I can't take back, and I need time to figure out how to make it right. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice careful and measured. What kind of mistake, Mom? Margaret looked at Robert's note, still lying on the desk where she had placed it. Her late husband's handwriting seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light, his words about trust and quiet love offering guidance even from beyond the grave. The kind that comes from thinking you know better than everyone else, she said. The kind that comes from being so afraid of losing your family that you push away the people trying to join it. Another long pause, then Michael's voice, gentler now. Mom, whatever happened, we can work through it. That's what families do. Not everything can be worked through, Michael. Some things can't be fixed once they're broken. Emma looked up at that, her eyes meeting Margaret's across the room. For the first time since Margaret had known her, Emma's expression was completely unguarded, showing a vulnerability that took Margaret's breath away. She could see the pain there, but also something else, a willingness to try again, to find a way forward despite everything that had been destroyed. Can I talk to David? Michael asked. I want to make sure he's okay. Margaret handed the phone to her son without a word. David took it reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. Hey, Mike. Yeah, we're home. No, everything's not okay. Look, can we talk about this tomorrow? I need some time to process what has happened here. Margaret could hear Michael's voice through the phone, asking questions that David deflected with increasing frustration. Finally, David said, Mom destroyed Emma's wedding dress. That's what happened. She cut it up with scissors because she thought... His voice broke and he couldn't finish the sentence. The silence from Michael's end of the line was deafening.
Margaret could picture her eldest son's face, the careful way he processed information when he was trying to understand something that defied logic. He had always been the family's problem solver, the one who could find rational explanations for emotional crises, but there was no rational explanation for what Margaret had done.
Put Mom back on the phone, Michael said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. David handed the phone back to Margaret, who took it with hands that were shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. Mom? Michael's voice was harder now, stripped of its earlier warmth. I don't know what's been going on with you lately, but this isn't you. The mother who raised me would never deliberately hurt someone the way you've apparently hurt Emma. Michael, No, let me finish. Emma has been nothing but kind to our family. She drove 6 hours to be at Christmas last year when she barely knew us. She sent Dad flowers every week during his treatment, even when he was too sick to acknowledge them. She learned to cook his favorite foods so she could bring them to the hospital. And you repaid that kindness by destroying the most important dress she'll ever own? Each accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had known about the flowers, had seen Emma quietly placing fresh arrangements in Robert's hospital room, but she had attributed it to obligation rather than genuine care. She had known about the food, had even eaten some of the meals Emma prepared, but she had seen it as Emma trying to show off her cooking skills rather than as an expression of love for a dying man. I didn't understand, Margaret whispered into the phone. I thought she didn't really care about us. Then you weren't paying attention, Michael said bluntly. Emma cares so much about our family that she learned Mandarin phrases so she could talk to Grandma Chen at the wedding. She researched Dad's military service so she could ask him meaningful questions about his time in the Navy. She studied our family photo albums so she could understand our history and traditions. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. Every piece of evidence Michael presented painted a picture of a woman who had been working harder than anyone to earn her place in their family, while Margaret had been building walls based on misinterpreted signals and unfounded fears. Where is she now? Michael asked. Is she okay? Margaret looked across the room at Emma, who was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by neat piles of sorted fabric and beadwork. She was holding a small piece of lace, turning it over in her hands with the same gentle care she might show to an injured animal. She's here, Margaret said into the phone. She's trying to salvage what she can of the dress. Of course she is, Michael said, and Margaret could hear the tears in his voice now. She's probably more worried about how you're feeling than about what you destroyed. That's who she is, Mom. That's who she's always been, and you've been too blind to see it. The truth of his words settled over Margaret like a physical weight. She looked at Emma and David, at the careful distance David was maintaining from both women while he tried to process his own emotions, at the way Emma kept glancing at him with concern despite her own devastation. Even now, even in this moment of profound loss, Emma's first instinct was to tend to the people around her rather than to focus on her own pain. I need to go, Margaret said into the phone. I need to figure out how to fix this. Some things can't be fixed, Mom, and that's not your choice to make. The call ended, leaving Margaret staring at her phone in the heavy silence of the bedroom. David was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, while Emma continued her methodical sorting as if it were the most important task in the world. He's right, you know, David said finally. About Emma. About everything she's done for our family. You've been so determined to see her as an outsider that you missed 2 years of her trying to prove she belonged. Margaret set her phone down on the desk next to Robert's note. I know, she said quietly. I can see that now. But knowing it doesn't undo what I've done. Emma looked up from her sorting, her eyes red, but her voice steady. Margaret, can I ask you something? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. What would it have taken? Emma asked. What could I have done differently to earn your acceptance? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Margaret realized that Emma deserved an honest answer, no matter how painful it might be to give. "Nothing," Margaret said finally, the admission scraping her throat raw. "There was nothing you could have done differently. The problem was never with you, Emma. The problem was with me." Emma's hands stilled in their sorting. "What do you mean?" Margaret looked around the room, at the evidence of her destructive certainty, at the faces of two people whose lives she had just irrevocably altered. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid that David was growing up and moving away from us. Afraid that after losing Robert, I was going to lose my children too. And instead of dealing with those fears honestly, I decided that you were the threat. That if I could just prove you weren't right for David, everything would go back to the way it was before." David's expression shifted from anger to something approaching pity. "Mom, I was never going to leave the family. Emma never wanted me to. She's been trying to join us, not take me away from you." "I can see that now," Margaret said. "But by the time I realized it, I had already destroyed the most precious thing you owned." She looked directly at Emma. "I destroyed your grandmother's pattern. I destroyed your connection to her memory. I destroyed something that could never be replaced. All because I was too stubborn and too frightened to see what was right in front of me." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the sorted piles of fabric. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "The dress was important to me," she said. "But it was just a symbol. What really mattered was the day itself, the promise David and I made to each other, the beginning of our life together. You can't destroy that, no matter how many dresses you cut up." The grace in that statement, the ability to distinguish between the symbol and the substance, to maintain perspective even in the face of deliberate destruction, left Margaret speechless. She had expected anger, demands for apologies, threats to cut off contact with the family. Instead, Emma was offering a kind of forgiveness that Margaret wasn't sure she deserved. "But," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger, "I need you to understand something. I can forgive what you did to the dress, but I can't pretend that it doesn't hurt to know that you've been judging me so harshly for 2 years. I can't pretend that it doesn't change how I feel about coming to family gatherings, knowing that you've been looking for reasons to disapprove of me." David reached across the space between them and took Emma's hand. "You don't have to pretend anything. And you don't have to keep trying to win over someone who's been determined to not like you." Margaret felt the full weight of those words. She had been so focused on protecting her family that she had driven away the person who most wanted to be part of it. She had been so afraid of losing David that she had poisoned his ability to share his happiness with the people he loved most. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice breaking on the name, "I am so sorry. I'm sorry for the dress, but I'm more sorry for the 2 years I wasted being suspicious of your motives instead of grateful for your kindness. I'm sorry for making David choose between his wife and his family. I'm sorry for being too proud to see what Robert saw, what everyone else saw, what was obvious to anyone who was really paying attention."
Emma nodded slowly, accepting the apology without immediately responding to it. Margaret could see her processing the words, weighing them against 2 years of careful treatment and polite distance. "I need some time," Emma said finally. "I need to think about what comes next, about whether I can be around you without feeling like I'm being tested or judged. I need to figure out how to trust that this change in your perspective is real and permanent, not just guilt talking."
It was a fair request, and Margaret knew it. She had spent 2 years earning Emma's wariness. She couldn't expect to undo that damage with a single apology, no matter how heartfelt. "I understand," Margaret said, "and I'll do whatever you need me to do to prove that I mean what I'm saying." Emma stood up slowly, her careful piles of fabric and beadwork arranged around her like the pieces of a puzzle that could never be properly reassembled. She looked around the room one last time, then at David, then at Margaret. "I'm going to go clean up," she said quietly. "I need a shower and some time to think. David, maybe you and your mother should talk about what happens next." She bent down and carefully scooped up one of the beaded pieces, a section that had once been part of the dress's intricate neckline. Margaret watched her cradle it gently, as if it were something still alive, rather than something destroyed. "Emma," Margaret called as she reached the door, "your grandmother's pattern. Do you have pictures of her original dress?" Emma turned back, confusion flickering across her face. "Yes? Why?" "Because," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with sudden determination, "maybe some things can be rebuilt, even if they can't be repaired." 3 months later, Margaret stood in the back room of Chen's alterations, watching Mrs. Liu carefully position a delicate piece of hand-tatted lace against ivory silk. The elderly seamstress had been working on the reconstruction project for 8 weeks now, her arthritic fingers moving with the precision that came from 60 years of couture work. Spread across 3 large tables were the beginnings of a wedding dress that would never replace what had been destroyed, but might offer something else entirely. A bridge between past and future, between guilt and redemption. "The beadwork, it is very complex," Mrs. Liu said in her careful English, adjusting her glasses to examine the pattern Margaret had brought her. "Your daughter-in-law's grandmother, she was very skilled seamstress. This design it'd take many, many hours to complete first time, to recreate from old photograph." She shook her head with a mixture of admiration and intimidation. Margaret nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. She had found Mrs. Liu through 3 weeks of searching, visiting every alteration shop and bridal boutique in a 50-mile radius until she found someone willing to take on what most had called an impossible project. Mrs. Liu had studied the photographs of Emma's grandmother's 1952 wedding dress with the intensity of an art historian examining a masterpiece, asking detailed questions about the original seamstress's techniques and the availability of similar materials. "I will pay whatever it costs. Time, materials, everything. This isn't about money." Mrs. Liu had looked at her with knowing eyes. She had said, "This is about family. About making right what was made wrong. I understand. I help you." The process had been more complex than Margaret had imagined. The original photographs were black and white, requiring careful analysis to determine colors and textures. The 1952 beading pattern had been created with materials that were no longer manufactured, necessitating custom work from a specialty supplier in New York. The lace had to be hand-tatted using techniques that few artisans still practiced, requiring Mrs. Liu to contact former colleagues who had retired decades ago. But the most challenging part hadn't been the technical reconstruction. It had been earning the right to attempt it at all.
Emma had moved out of David's childhood bedroom the day after the incident, taking only her clothes and leaving everything else behind. She and David had rented a small apartment across town while they figured out how to navigate the new reality of their family dynamics. For 3 weeks, Margaret had heard nothing from them, except secondhand reports from Michael and Sarah, who had driven down from their respective cities to assess the damage and attempt some kind of family mediation. The conversation with Sarah had been particularly difficult. Margaret's daughter had always been the family's emotional compass, the one who could find the silver lining in any crisis and help everyone move forward. But when Sarah had seen the destroyed dress, still scattered across David's bedroom floor where Margaret had left it like evidence of her shame, her usual optimism had cracked. "Mom, what were you thinking?" Sarah had asked, her voice breaking as she knelt down to examine the remnants. "This is Emma's grandmother's pattern. This dress was her connection to family history, just like your wedding dress is yours."
Margaret had tried to explain about the fear, about the misunderstandings, about Robert's note and the realizations that had come too late. But explanations felt hollow in the face of such deliberate destruction. Sarah had listened with the patience of someone trying to understand a foreign language, shaking her head periodically as if Margaret's words weren't quite making sense. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest," Sarah had said finally. "Did you really not see how hard Emma was trying? Did you really miss all the ways she was showing love to our family?" Margaret had spent the next hour cataloging her blindness for her daughter, the flowers for Robert that she had dismissed as obligation, the care packages that she had interpreted as showing off, the quiet acts of service that she had attributed to manipulation rather than genuine affection. With each example, Sarah's expression had grown more horrified, until finally she had stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the street where Emma had learned to parallel park during her first month of living with David. "You know what the worst part is?" Sarah had said without turning around. "Emma asked me once what she could do to make you like her more. This was about 6 months ago, and she was so worried that she was causing problems between you and David. I told her to just be patient, that you needed time to get used to changes in the family. I told her that you were a good person who would come around once you saw how much she loved David." The memory of that conversation still made Margaret's chest tight with regret. Sarah's disappointment had been almost worse than David's anger because it came from someone who had always believed the best about Margaret's character. Michael's response had been different but equally devastating. Her practical eldest son had approached the situation like an engineering problem, analyzing the cause and effect relationships that had led to such a catastrophic failure of family dynamics. His questions had been precise and unforgiving. How long had Margaret been harboring these feelings about Emma? What specific actions had Emma taken that Margaret had interpreted as problematic? Why hadn't Margaret spoken directly to Emma about her concerns instead of letting resentment build? Margaret had no defense against that accusation because it was entirely accurate. She had applied a different standard to Emma, had allowed fears and insecurities to override the values she had spent decades instilling in her children. The path back to any kind of relationship with David and Emma had begun with a letter. Margaret had written and rewritten it dozens of times, struggling to find words that conveyed the depth of her regret without sounding self-serving or manipulative. She had wanted to explain her actions without excusing them, to acknowledge the damage she had caused without minimizing its impact. In the end, the letter had been simple: an apology, an acknowledgement of her mistakes, and a request for the chance to prove that she could change. She had also included the photographs
of the reconstruction project she was planning, asking for Emma's permission to attempt it and her input on details that only she would know. Emma's response had come 2 weeks later, delivered through David. She was willing to meet with Margaret, but only in a neutral location and only with specific ground rules. Margaret would not attempt to justify her actions, would not expect immediate forgiveness, and would not pressure Emma to resume normal family relationships before she was ready. The meeting had taken place at a small cafe downtown, with David sitting between them like a translator at a diplomatic summit. Emma had been polite but distant, answering Margaret's questions about the dress reconstruction with the same careful courtesy she had always shown. But there had been something different in her eyes. Not the eager-to-please expression Margaret remembered, but something sadder and more guarded. "Why does this matter to you now?" Emma had asked after Margaret explained the reconstruction project. "The dress is gone. The wedding is over. What do you think making a new dress is going to accomplish?" Margaret had struggled to articulate her motivations without sounding selfish. "I can't undo what I did," she had said finally, "but I can show you that I understand what I destroyed. I can honor your grandmother's memory the way I should have honored it from the beginning." Emma had been quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee absently while she considered Margaret's words. "My grandmother always told me that intentions matter more than outcomes," she had said finally. "But she also told me that people show you who they really are through their actions, not their words. If you want to do this, if you think it will help somehow, then you have my permission, but don't expect it to fix what's broken between us."
That conversation had been 6 weeks ago, and Margaret was beginning to understand the wisdom in Emma's cautious approach to reconciliation. Trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with grand gestures alone. It required consistent, patient demonstration of changed behavior over time. Mrs. Liu held up a section of the reconstructed bodice, examining the way the light caught the recreated beadwork. "Is getting close to original," she said with satisfaction. "Your daughter-in-law's grandmother, she would be proud of this work." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her throat at the mention of Emma's grandmother. Through the reconstruction process, she had learned more about the woman who had raised Emma than she had bothered to discover during 2 years of family gatherings. Emma's grandmother had been a seamstress herself, had emigrated from Ireland in the 1940s and built a small tailoring business that supported her family for 40 years. She had been widowed young and had raised 3 children alone, including Emma's father, who had died in a car accident when Emma was 19. Emma was all she had left, Mrs. Liu had told Margaret during one of their work sessions. Mrs. Liu's own granddaughter had gone to school with Emma, and the connections in their small community had provided insights that Margaret had never thought to seek. Very quiet girl, but very devoted to her grandmother. Every weekend, she'd come to help with sewing projects. She learned traditional techniques that most young people don't want to learn anymore. The picture that emerged from these conversations was of a young woman who had been shaped by loss and responsibility, who had learned to express love through service rather than words because her grandmother's generation valued actions over emotional displays. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. "How's the progress today? Emma's been asking about the project." It was the first indication she'd received that Emma was thinking about the reconstruction as anything more than an obligation she had agreed to tolerate. "Very good progress," Margaret typed back. "Mrs. Liu thinks another 2 weeks for completion. Would Emma like to see photos of the current work?" The response came quickly. Yes, she would like that very much. Margaret took several photos of the dress in its current state, marveling at Mrs. Liu's skill in recreating something from black and white photographs and her own imperfect descriptions. The beadwork wasn't identical to the original. Some techniques had been lost to time, and certain materials were no longer available, but it captured the spirit of Emma's grandmother's design with remarkable fidelity. As she prepared to send the photos, Margaret found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Robert's doctor 3 months before his death. Dr. Patterson had mentioned that terminal patients often worried most about the relationships they were leaving behind, about unresolved conflicts and unfinished emotional business. At the time, Margaret had been focused entirely on medical treatments and comfort care. But now she wondered if Robert's note to Emma had been part of a larger effort to ensure that his family would remain intact after his death. "Your husband was a very wise man," Mrs. Liu said, as if reading Margaret's thoughts. "He understands that families need bridge builders, not wall builders. Your daughter-in-law, she is bridge builder. You learning to be one too." Margaret nodded, understanding that this reconstruction project was as much about rebuilding herself as it was about recreating a dress. Every stitch Mrs. Liu placed was a meditation on patience and precision, on the value of taking time to get things right rather than rushing to judgment. Every bead that was carefully positioned reminded Margaret of the attention to detail required for genuine understanding rather than surface assumptions. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the shop windows, casting long shadows across the work tables. Margaret gathered her purse and prepared to leave, but Mrs. Liu stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "I have a question for you," the elderly seamstress said. "When dress is finished, how you will present to your daughter-in-law? This is important moment. Cannot be wrong again." Margaret had been thinking about this question for weeks, but she still didn't have a clear answer. The dress wasn't a replacement for what she had destroyed. Nothing could be that. It wasn't an apology exactly, though it was motivated by regret. It wasn't a demand for forgiveness, though she hoped it might contribute to healing. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "I need to let Emma decide what it means to her. My job is just to create something beautiful and give it to her without expectations." Mrs. Liu smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Margaret had seen from her during their weeks of working together. "Now you understand," she said. "Gift without strings, love without conditions. This is how family should be." Margaret left the shop with those words echoing in her mind.
The drive home took her past David and Emma's new apartment, a small complex near the university where David had gotten his engineering degree. She had driven by several times over the past 3 months, never stopping, but somehow comforted by the sight of Emma's car in the parking lot, by the evidence that her son and daughter-in-law were building a life together despite the damage Margaret had caused. Tonight, Sarah and Michael were coming for dinner, the first family gathering since the incident. David and Emma had been invited, but had politely declined, and Margaret understood that their absence was both a boundary and a gift. It would allow the siblings to process what had happened without the pressure of managing competing loyalties. As Margaret pulled into her driveway, she saw Sarah's car already there, her daughter's punctuality as reliable as ever. The house felt different now, emptier somehow, as if Robert's absence had been made more acute by the additional loss of David and Emma's regular presence. Margaret had been forced to confront the reality that her fear of losing family had actually accelerated that loss, had driven away the very people she had been trying to protect. Sarah met her at the front door with a hug that was warmer than Margaret had expected, but still carried an undertone of careful assessment. Her daughter was dressed in the casual elegance that suited her work as a marketing executive, but her eyes held the same concern that Margaret remembered from Sarah's childhood when she had appointed herself the family's emotional caretaker. "How did it go today?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the kitchen together. "Michael's already here. He's setting up his laptop in Dad's study to show us some pictures of the kids."
Margaret felt a familiar pang at the mention of Robert's study. It had been his sanctuary during the final months of his illness, the place where he had written his final letters and organized his papers. She had barely been able to enter the room since his death, but Michael's use of it for family purposes felt like a small step toward reclaiming the space for living rather than just mourning. "The dress is beautiful," Margaret said, setting her purse on the kitchen counter. "Mrs. Liu is incredibly talented. I think Emma's grandmother would approve of what she's creating." Sarah nodded, but Margaret could see the questions in her eyes. Questions about whether this gesture would actually accomplish anything meaningful, whether Margaret was truly changing or just trying to ease her own guilt through expensive gestures. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to really think about your answer. Are you doing this reconstruction because you think it will fix your relationship with Emma, or because you genuinely want to honor her grandmother's memory?" It was exactly the kind of direct question that Margaret had been asking herself for weeks. The honest answer was complicated. Her motivations were a mixture of guilt, love, and genuine respect for what she had destroyed. But Sarah deserved honesty, especially after the months of deception and misunderstanding that had led to this crisis. "Both," Margaret said finally. "I can't separate wanting to make amends from wanting to understand what I destroyed. Learning about Emma's grandmother, working with Mrs. Liu to recreate something beautiful, it's helped me see Emma differently. It's helped me see myself differently, too." Sarah studied her mother's face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's actually not what we're suggesting," Sarah said gently. "We think you should start with individual therapy. Work on understanding your own patterns and fears before you try to rebuild relationships with David and Emma." Margaret felt her defenses rising, the familiar urge to explain and justify rather than simply listen. But she caught herself, recognizing the impulse as part of the problem that had led to this crisis in the first place. "I can see why you think that would help, but I'm not sure therapy can change what's already been done. The damage is already there." Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Mom, do you remember what you told me when I was struggling in my marriage 5 years ago? When Jennifer and I were having those communication problems?" Margaret nodded, remembering the difficult period when Michael's work stress had spilled over into his relationship, creating cycles of misunderstanding and resentment that had nearly ended their marriage. "You told me that the goal wasn't to erase the problems we'd had, but to learn better tools for handling problems in the future. You said that every relationship has damage, but healthy relationships have repair mechanisms." The wisdom of her own advice, reflected back to her in this context, made her chest tighten with recognition.
She had been so focused on undoing the specific harm she had caused that she hadn't considered the larger question of how to prevent similar harm in the future. Dr. Chen, no relation, Sarah added with a small smile, comes highly recommended. She specializes in family dynamics and cultural integration issues. Michael and I thought that might be relevant, given some of the assumptions you made about Emma's background and communication style. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing the idea of examining her own psychology with a stranger, of admitting to a professional that she had so fundamentally misunderstood her daughter-in-law's character. But the alternative, continuing to operate from the same fears and assumptions that had led to this crisis, seemed far worse. Would you want me to tell David and Emma that I'm doing this? Or would this be something private just for my own growth? That's up to you, Michael said. But I think they'd appreciate knowing that you're taking concrete steps to understand what went wrong, rather than just focusing on grand gestures.
The conversation continued through dinner preparation and the meal itself, with Margaret's children carefully but persistently addressing the various ways that family dynamics would need to change going forward. They talked about Margaret's tendency to assume negative motives when family members made choices she didn't understand. They discussed the difference between being protective and being controlling. They explored the cultural biases that had shaped Margaret's expectations for how Emma should demonstrate affection and belonging. It was painful but necessary work, made easier by the obvious love and concern her children showed, even as they held her accountable for her mistakes. As the evening wound down, Margaret felt exhausted but also oddly hopeful. For the first time since the incident, she had a concrete path forward that didn't depend on Emma's forgiveness or David's willingness to overlook her actions. 2 weeks later, Margaret stood in Mrs. Liu's shop for the final fitting of the reconstructed dress. The elderly seamstress had outdone herself, creating something that honored the original design while incorporating subtle improvements that reflected decades of additional experience. The beadwork caught the light in the same way Emma's grandmother's dress had in the old photographs, and the silhouette was both timeless and elegant. "It is finished," Mrs. Liu said with satisfaction, stepping back to admire her work. "Not same as original, but maybe better. Has all the love of original plus all the learning that come from making mistakes." Margaret touched the delicate lace sleeves with reverent fingers. "Emma's grandmother would be proud," she said, meaning it completely. "Your daughter-in-law will be proud too," Mrs. Liu replied. "Not just of dress, but of you. Takes courage to admit being wrong. Takes more courage to do work of changing." Margaret had started therapy 3 days after her conversation with Michael and Sarah. Dr. Chen, whose name had indeed been a coincidence, was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who specialized in helping people understand the difference between love and control, between protection and possession. Their sessions had been uncomfortable but illuminating, forcing Margaret to examine the fears that had driven her behavior and the assumptions that had shaped her judgments. Fear of abandonment often manifests as attempts to control the people we love. When we're afraid of losing someone, we sometimes try to dictate the terms of their relationship with us. But that usually drives them away faster than any external threat would. Margaret had begun to understand that her treatment of Emma had been motivated by the same fear that had driven her to work so hard to create perfect family traditions, to maintain close relationships with her children, to build a home that everyone would want to return to. But somewhere along the way, her efforts to create belonging had become efforts to control how belonging was expressed. The hardest lesson for many parents, Dr. Chen had continued, is learning that our children's partners don't have to love us the way our children do. They don't have to appreciate our traditions or communicate in our style or prioritize our needs. They just have to love our children well and be willing to find their own way of connecting with the family. Now, standing in Mrs. Liu's shop with the completed dress, Margaret felt the weight of those realizations. Emma had been trying to find her own way of connecting, but Margaret had been too focused on her own expectations to recognize the attempts. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David.
Emma would like to meet you tomorrow to see the dress. Would 2 p.m. at Mrs. Liu's shop work for you?" Margaret's heart started racing as she typed back her agreement. After 3 months of separation and careful distance, she was finally going to see Emma again, and she was terrified. What if the dress didn't mean what Margaret hoped it would? What if Emma saw it as another attempt at manipulation rather than genuine regret? What if Margaret said the wrong thing and undid the small progress that had been made? "You nervous about tomorrow?" Mrs. Liu asked, noticing Margaret's hands shaking as she put her phone away. "Terrified," Margaret admitted.
Mrs. Liu smiled with the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many difficult family reconciliations through her work as a seamstress. "Good," she said, "means you understand how important this is. When you're not nervous about family, that's when you make biggest mistakes." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room with the dress carefully laid out on the couch beside her, still wrapped in Mrs. Liu's protective tissue paper. She had been practicing what she would say to Emma, but every version of her planned speech sounded either too formal or too emotional, too apologetic or too explanatory. Finally, she called Dr. Chen's emergency line, something she had never done before but felt necessary given the importance of the next day's meeting. "I don't know what to say to her," Margaret confessed when the therapist called back. "I've been working on this dress for 3 months. I've been in therapy for 2 weeks. I understand so much more about what I did wrong, but I don't know how to communicate that without sounding like I'm trying to convince her to forgive me." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment before responding. "What would you want to communicate if forgiveness wasn't a possibility? If you knew that Emma would never trust you again, but you still wanted to give her this dress, what would you want her to know?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I would want her to know that I see her clearly now, that I understand what a good person she is, what a good wife she is to David, what a valuable addition she is to our family. I would want her to know that the problem was never with her, it was with my own fears and prejudices. And I would want her to know that her grandmother's memory is safe with our family, that we will honor it, even if Emma chooses to keep her distance from us." "Then tell her that," Dr. Chen said simply. "Tell her exactly that without expecting anything in return." The next afternoon, Margaret arrived at Mrs. Liu's shop 15 minutes early, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She had barely slept the night before, alternating between excitement about seeing Emma again and terror about saying the wrong thing. The dress hung on a special display rack that Mrs. Liu had set up near the window, where the afternoon light would show off the intricate beadwork to best advantage. "Remember," Mrs. Liu said as they waited, "this dress is gift. No strings, no expectations, just love made visible." When Emma arrived, she looked different than Margaret remembered, more confident somehow, less eager to please. She was wearing a simple blue dress that Margaret recognized from their early family dinners, but her posture was straighter, her expression more self-assured. David was with her, staying close but allowing her to take the lead in the interaction. "Hello, Margaret," Emma said, her voice polite but not warm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Emma moved toward the dress slowly, her steps careful and deliberate. When she reached the display rack, she stood quietly for a long moment, taking in the intricate recreation of her grandmother's design. "It's beautiful," Emma said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not exactly the same, but it captures the spirit of what my grandmother created." Margaret stepped forward slightly, careful not to invade Emma's space. "Mrs. Liu is an artist, but I want you to know that this isn't meant to replace what I destroyed. Nothing could do that. This is meant to honor your grandmother's memory and to show you that I understand now what I failed to understand before." Emma reached out and touched one of the beaded sleeves, her fingers tracing the delicate pattern. "You learned about my grandmother," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I learned that she raised you to express love through service rather than words. I learned that she taught you to do good deeds quietly, without expecting recognition. I learned that she gave you strength to survive losing your parents and wisdom to build a life based on devotion rather than drama." Margaret's voice caught slightly.
I learned that she raised you to be exactly the kind of woman any mother would be grateful to have as a daughter-in-law, and I was too blind to see it.
The truth of that statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had been so focused on protecting her family from imaginary threats that she had missed the opportunity to welcome someone who would have enriched their lives immeasurably. "Emma," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work to become the kind of mother-in-law your grandmother would have wanted for you. Not because I expect anything in return, but because it's the right thing to do." Emma finally looked directly at Margaret, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I can't promise that things will go back to the way they were before," she said. "I'm not sure I want them to. But I can promise that I'm willing to try to build something new, something better, if you're really committed to changing." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was possibility. It was hope. It was the chance to prove that Margaret could love without controlling, could welcome without demanding, could be the kind of family member that Emma deserved. David stepped forward then, his own eyes emotional. "Mom, Emma and I have been talking about family traditions, about how to honor both of our backgrounds as we build our life together. We'd like to invite you to be part of that conversation when you're ready." Margaret nodded, overwhelmed by the generosity of that offer. "I would be honored, and I promise to listen more than I speak." Emma smiled then, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her since the incident. "That's all any of us can do," she said. "Listen, learn, and try to do better tomorrow than we did today." Mrs. Liu stepped forward with a garment bag, carefully removing the dress from its display rack. "This dress," she said, "it represents new beginning. Not replacement for what was lost, but foundation for what can be built." As Margaret watched Emma accept the reconstructed dress, she realized that Mrs. Liu was right. This wasn't about returning to the past or erasing her mistakes. This was about building something entirely new, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed obligations, understanding rather than expectations, chosen connection rather than imposed belonging. For the first time in months, Margaret felt genuine hope for the future. In the quiet suburbs where perfectly manicured lawns mask imperfect family dramas, Margaret Chen made a choice that would define the next 2 decades of her life. In a moment of fear, control, and devastating poor judgment, she destroyed her daughter-in-law Emma's wedding dress, a precious heirloom that had belonged to Emma's late grandmother, the only family keepsake she had left after losing her parents as a child. This wasn't just fabric and beading that Margaret tore apart that terrible afternoon. It was trust, love, and the fragile foundation of a family relationship that had never quite found its footing. What followed was a journey that would test the limits of forgiveness, the power of accountability, and the possibility that even the most damaged relationships could be rebuilt into something stronger than they were before. Margaret had always been a woman who expressed love through control. As a traditional Chinese-American mother, she had specific visions of how her family should look, how relationships should develop, and how her children's lives should unfold. When her son David married Emma, a quiet, orphaned young woman with no family connections and mysterious past, Margaret felt threatened by what she couldn't understand or manage. Emma represented everything Margaret feared: the unknown, the uncontrollable, the different. Where Margaret was vocal and directive, Emma was quiet and observant. Where Margaret believed in grand gestures and clear expectations, Emma showed love through small, consistent actions that Margaret failed to recognize or value. The wedding dress incident wasn't spontaneous violence, it was the culmination of 2 years of mounting tension, misunderstanding, and Margaret's growing desperation to maintain control over her son's life. When she discovered the dress in Emma's closet while helping to prepare for a family celebration, something snapped. All her fears about losing David, about Emma's mysterious background, about changes in her carefully constructed family dynamic converged in a moment of destructive rage. The aftermath was devastating. Emma's heartbreak was profound, but quiet. She didn't scream or demand retribution. Instead, she withdrew, creating the kind of polite distance that Margaret gradually realized was more painful than any confrontation would have been. David was torn between loyalty to his mother and protection of his wife, while the extended family watched in horror as Margaret's actions created fractures that seemed impossible to repair. What makes this story remarkable isn't the initial destruction. Families implode over smaller offenses every day. What's extraordinary is what Margaret chose to do next. Instead of doubling down on her position, making excuses, or waiting for the situation to blow over, she began the painful work of understanding why she had acted so destructively. The journey started with Margaret's sister Linda, who forced her to confront the reality that her behavior had been unacceptable regardless of her intentions or fears. Linda's tough love, delivered with the authority of someone who had known Margaret her entire life, broke through decades of self-justification and forced Margaret to see her actions from Emma's perspective. Margaret discovered that the wedding dress wasn't just clothing, it was Emma's last tangible connection to the grandmother who had raised her after her parents' deaths. The dress represented family history, feminine wisdom passed down through generations, and the hope that Emma could create new family traditions while honoring old ones. By destroying it, Margaret had attacked the very thing she claimed to value, family legacy and connection. Rather than simply apologizing and hoping time would heal the wounds, Margaret embarked on something far more difficult. She committed to reconstructing the dress. Working with Mrs. Liu, a master seamstress who specialized in restoration work, Margaret spent months painstakingly rebuilding what she had destroyed. But the dress reconstruction was never just about fabric and beading. It became a metaphor for the deeper work Margaret needed to do on herself and her relationships. Each careful stitch forced her to confront her own motivations, her fears about change and loss of control, her inability to recognize love when it was expressed differently than she expected. The physical work was meditative and humbling. Margaret, who had always been someone who gave orders rather than taking them, had to learn patience, precision, and acceptance of guidance from others. Mrs. Liu became not just a seamstress, but a teacher, sharing wisdom about the difference between repair and replacement, about honoring original intentions while adapting to new realities. As word of the reconstruction project spread through the family, Margaret faced a new challenge. Her children's united insistence that she enter family therapy. Michael and Sarah had watched their mother's controlling tendencies for years, and they recognized that rebuilding the dress wouldn't address the underlying patterns that had led to its destruction. Dr. Chen, the family therapist, helped Margaret understand that her controlling behavior stemmed from deep fears about loss and change. Having immigrated from Taiwan as a young woman, having lost her husband, Robert, to illness, having watched her children grow up in a culture different from her own, Margaret had developed an unconscious belief that maintaining strict control was the only way to prevent further loss. The therapy sessions were brutal and transformative. Margaret had to confront the ways her protective behavior had actually been manipulative, how her concern had often been invasive, how her traditions had sometimes been weapons used to exclude rather than include. She learned to distinguish between caring about someone and trying to control them, between offering support and imposing expectations. Most importantly, she began to understand Emma not as a threat to be managed, but as a person to be known. Through therapy and careful observation, she realized that Emma's quiet strength had exactly what David needed, that her different way of expressing love had enriched their family rather than threatened it, and that her mysterious past had made her more resilient rather than less trustworthy.
The dress reconstruction took 9 months. Coincidentally, the same amount of time it takes to grow a human life. When Margaret finally presented the reconstructed dress to Emma, it was transformed. Still recognizably the original, but adapted to accommodate Emma's body and style, strengthened by new supportive structures, beautiful in ways that honored both tradition and innovation. Emma's response was everything Margaret had hoped for and feared: tears, gratitude, and the cautious beginning of rebuilt trust. But forgiveness, they both learned, was a process rather than a moment.
Emma needed time to believe that Margaret's change was permanent rather than performative, while Margaret had to prove through consistent behavior that she had truly learned to love without controlling. The family celebrations that followed were different, more relaxed, more inclusive, more authentic. Margaret learned to step back and let others contribute, to appreciate different ways of showing care, to find joy in chaos rather than insisting on perfection. Emma gradually began sharing more of herself, her cooking, her stories, her quiet humor that emerged once she felt safe to express it. Over the following decades, Margaret's transformation rippled through the entire family. She became a grandmother who supported rather than directed, who celebrated her grandchildren's individual personalities rather than trying to mold them into predetermined shapes. She learned to appreciate her children's choices in partners, careers, and lifestyles, even when those choices were different from what she had envisioned. The reconstructed dress became a family heirloom in ways the original never could have been. It was worn at multiple weddings, graduations, and celebrations, each time carrying the story of how beautiful things could emerge from brokenness when people chose courage over comfort, growth over stagnation, and love over fear. Emma and David's children grew up hearing the story of the dress, not as a cautionary tale about family conflict, but as proof that people could change, that mistakes could be repaired, that love was strong enough to survive even serious damage when it was properly understood and carefully practiced. Margaret's relationship with Emma evolved into something neither had expected: genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to family well-being. Emma learned to value Margaret's experience and wisdom while maintaining healthy boundaries, while Margaret learned to offer support without conditions, guidance without control. What makes Margaret's story remarkable isn't that she made a terrible mistake. Many people destroy relationships through fear and misunderstanding. What's extraordinary is that she chose accountability over defensiveness, growth over justification, persistent love over wounded pride. Margaret's journey demonstrates that change is possible at any age, that deeply ingrained patterns of behavior can be modified when people are willing to do the difficult work of self-examination. Her story shows that apologies without corresponding behavioral change are meaningless, but that genuine transformation can heal even severely damaged relationships. The family that emerged from this crisis was stronger than the one that had existed before, not because conflict had been avoided, but because it had been faced honestly and worked through completely. Margaret and Emma's story became a model for the younger generations about the importance of admitting mistakes, the power of forgiveness, and the possibility that love could grow deeper through difficulty rather than being destroyed by it. 20 years after she destroyed Emma's wedding dress, Margaret stood in her garden surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known a time when she and Emma weren't close. The woman who had once tried to control every detail of family gatherings had learned to find joy in beautiful chaos, to celebrate differences rather than demanding conformity, to love people as they were rather than as she thought they should be.
The reconstructed dress continued to be worn at family celebrations, each time carrying the story of transformation and renewal. But the real reconstruction had been of Margaret herself, from a woman driven by fear into someone motivated by love, from someone who tried to possess her family into someone who cherished their independence, from someone who saw differences as threats into someone who celebrated them as gifts. Margaret's story reminds us that it's never too late to change, that love is strong enough to survive our worst moments when we're willing to do the work of becoming better people. It shows us that the most beautiful relationships are often those that have weathered serious storms and emerged stronger, that forgiveness is possible even after devastating betrayals, and that families can create new traditions while honoring old ones. In the end, Margaret's greatest gift to her family wasn't the perfectly reconstructed dress. It was the perfectly imperfect example of how people can grow, change, and learn to love more wisely, even after making terrible mistakes. Her legacy became proof that second chances, when earned through genuine transformation, can create something more beautiful than anything that existed before.
If this story of family healing, cross-cultural understanding, and the transformative power of accountability resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories that explore the complexity of human relationships, the possibility of change, and the enduring strength of love expressed through action rather than words. Subscribe now for more narratives that celebrate the courage it takes to grow, the wisdom it takes to forgive, and the hope that exists in every opportunity to begin again.